Practitioner, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. Ambassador Khalilzad was born in Mazar-i-Sharif in Afghanistan, raised in Kabul. He came to the United States for the first time as a high school exchange student. He went to high school for a year in California. He then went to college in Beirut, and then came to the United States again to do his PhD at the University of Chicago. He stuck around the United States and started teaching at Columbia University in 1979. If any of you know your Afghan history, 1979 is an important year. He ended up serving while teaching at Columbia as a kind of an informal advisor to U.S. policymakers right off the get-go after the Soviet invasion of his home country. He served in the Reagan administration on the State Department's policy planning staff, in the H.W. Bush administration, in the State Department, in the Defense Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Policy Planning. Spent the 90s at the RAND Corporation, and then joined the George W. Bush administration working on the NSC staff, and eventually rose to be U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, then the U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, and finally the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations. So he's a long and distinguished scholarly career and a policy career as well. His memoir has been out this spring, The Envoy. It's a uniquely American story, and it's a great story of just a person's life, but also it's got some great observations about how policymaking actually happens in D.C. So we're privileged to be joined today by Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. Thank you to all of you for coming this afternoon. As Dr. Miller said, I have written a book. And the reason for writing the book was that I have had quite a lot of experiences in dealing with national security issues during the course of my career, and I thought I owed it to future scholars and practitioners to write on my experiences, to provide lessons learned, both about the process here at home and also about achieving results in the field where rubber meets the road, what works, what does not work, and how we can do better in the world. So I hope those of you who get a chance to read the book, access it, will benefit from it if your field of interest is international affairs and the U.S. role in the world, and what U.S. should or should not do. I'd like to open the discussion with 5 points based on the book and the current circumstances in the world. And then I look forward to your observations, questions, and will be happy to respond. One is that the world is in a very especially difficult set of circumstances right now. In probably contemporary history, there has never been a time where you have so many changes, so many crises going on simultaneously in so many parts of the world. There is almost no part of the world, when you look at Europe, or you look at Africa, you look at the Middle East, you look at Asia, where significant changes and challenges are not taking place. And there have always been challenges, but the simultaneity of challenges in so many places, that's I would say, is relatively unique. There are changes both at the very high level, meaning in terms of relations among great powers, but also below the great power levels, where the impact of information technologies, the growing awareness of the world by the population around the world is leading to fragmentation, politicization of smaller identities. I am most familiar, of course, given my service in the broader Middle East, as we used to call it, where in the 70s when I was studying in Lebanon, bigger identities were politicized. Arab nationalism was, you had the issue of Nasserism, Baathism, the big issue. Now the big issues are sectarian identity, or your Shia or your Sunni, smaller ethnic identities that are prevailing. So, and in terms of big power relations, for many years we thought that at least since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps even before, during the Cold War, that war among big powers were unthinkable. But now there is a greater chance of not only increased tensions, but perhaps even conflict among major powers. And we also have a situation in which there is significant domestic differences in the United States about what to do with regard to the world. From the consensus of the Cold War, where there was broad agreement that containing the Soviet Union was the right objective, and that marshaled our resources to deal with the threat of the Soviet Union, to a post-Cold War period of U.S. preeminence, the end of history, the hope that democracy and prosperity and freedom will spread to the rest of the world. We have a situation that because of what has happened and the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, the downside of globalization in terms of challenges that is posing, whether it's with regard to trade, it's with regard to immigration, with regard to what the U.S. should or should not do in the world, particularly the issues of state and nation building overseas, the issue of alliances, which were largely a consensus on, that those alliances are all good, those alliances were a great achievement of U.S. foreign policy, that through alliances in Europe and Asia, not only we managed to contain the Soviet Union, but we stabilized Europe and stabilized East Asia. There are questions even about the utility of the alliances as they are, questioning whether they're adequately contributing to the burden sharing for dealing with the challenges that the world produces. So, in my view, 2 weeks out from election, the next president will inherit a very difficult global environment and a very difficult domestic environment for building a bipartisan foreign policy. And he or she has a work cut out for her as to how to build a bipartisan foreign policy going forward, given the domestic polarization and the enormous number of challenges that the world is posing. I see at least, I'm not going to talk in detail about it because that's not the main purpose of the book. There's 3 possible responses. We'd be happy to discuss it during the question and answer period. There's one of restoration, one could call it broadly, how to restore U.S. preeminence and U.S. hegemony, some would say, or global leadership. The first few years of the post-Cold War period, some of the strategies proposed and perhaps even embraced thought that our goal should be to preclude the rise of a rival and to have a world in which the US preeminence prevails until the end of time, so to speak. That's the best order, not only for us, but also for the world in which the US is dominant, is a peaceful, democratic, prosperous world. And some believe that there has been degradation or abandonment or mismanagement of that period, of that role, and then we need to, the goal should be to restore that, versus those at the other end who believe that we should, some call it America First, or some call it Fortress America, some call it isolationism, in which we need to focus on ourselves. We cannot be the world's policeman, and this will cause overextension. We've already been overextended, spent too much, and others should take responsibility for their own security, and there's too much free ridership. This is too burdensome, too dangerous, therefore undesirable. And then there is the in-between school, which would say, yes, U.S. global leadership is important, but that leadership needs to be pursued perhaps differently than in the past. Focus on different issues than those of the past, and be pursued in a way that others carry a greater share of the burden than they have in the past. That rather than being dominant, we become a balancer, that we try to encourage balances of power in different regions. And the U.S. role it would be when the balance is in danger because one side is not doing enough, we tilt a little bit that way. And when the balance is going in another direction, we tilt the other way. The requirements of a balancer versus the requirement of being dominant are different, and therefore I see a discussion in the foreign policy circles about what mix is the right mix for the next president to follow. And also, in order to build bipartisanship, some issues such as immigration, the downside of globalization, a consensus needs to be arrived at, and trade needs to be arrived at, and economic issues need to be much more focused on than in the past. And I would leave that at that point one being that we are in a difficult, challenging, both external and internal circumstances for building an effective bipartisan foreign policy and developing a grand strategy or a strategy that could be as a filter for prioritizing what should we focus on, what shouldn't we, what has priority over what else. To build that is going to be one of the biggest challenges that the next president will face. Second point, I believe that some of our institutions need to be reformed, and we need to look at them. Based on my experience, as I said before, I will repeat myself, the purpose of writing the book, and what I'm just saying now is more the content of the book, is needs to be examined. One is the whole issue of state and nation building. I spent a lot of my time in Iraq and Afghanistan to assist these countries develop the institutions of the state and the political agreements to create order in those countries and to preclude threats that we were worried about before from restarting or re-emerging. And the first big point that I want to make is that we need to be very, very selective in terms of taking on state and nation building exercises. They can be extremely expensive, as Afghanistan and Iraq were. They can take a very long time, given which countries you do it in, because their level of development, their composition, their historic experiences, their political culture, all of those are important, and in some cases it can be extremely difficult and time-consuming and costly, and therefore one needs to be extremely selective. Certainly one shouldn't be doing two of them at the same time as we did. One is costly or difficult and time-consuming enough, but do two big ones at the same time, of course, in an unfamiliar part of the world, was difficult. But I worry now that we may be over-learning and that we may be coming to a judgment that we should never do state and nation. And as you've heard in the course of the current campaign, this argument being raised very forcefully. And I believe that given the uncertainty in the world, unpredictability of the world, we may face a set of circumstances in which doing some nation and state building may be the best option of the various options available. And therefore one should not throw away all the lessons learned, the capabilities developed based on the mistakes made, trial and error that the country had to go through as we try to do what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because I believe that Afghanistan, who would have thought in 2000 or 1999 that we would be doing state and nation building in Afghanistan, except for 9/11. And then once 9/11 had happened, the consensus in the nation at that time was that we should never allow Afghanistan to once again become a place from which an attack against the United States could take place because of a terrorist presence there, Al-Qaeda. And a lot of you may not be old enough to remember that, but it was present in Afghanistan. Totally unexpected, an attack on the United States from Afghanistan. And so, given that you say you don't want another attack or a sanctuary for terrorists to develop in that country, what options do you have to preclude that? One is that you occupy Afghanistan or another piece of territory. That can be very expensive, very costly. But we think of Afghanistan as a small country, but it's a very large country. It's as big as Texas, which is larger, or France, and with terrible, complicated geography and other issues. The other option is that you help friendly Afghans to control the territory to avoid the return of terrorists or extremists. That's called state or nation building in part, when you assist locals to develop an army, a police force, state institutions. Or the third is that you don't do either one, but you keep forces ready to attack targets as terrorist targets emerge, which is almost, could be like a permanent war, as we've been doing in part with regard to parts of Pakistan for 15, 16 years. Drone attacks every now and then against targets. So therefore, because the world is unpredictable, because threat could emerge from places that we don't necessarily can anticipate, despite we have a lot of brilliant people in our government and outside who focus on the world, we get surprised constantly. And therefore, some capacity to do state and nation building, in my judgment, is warranted to be maintained. But I do agree we need to be far more selective and to avoid especially multiple state and nation building exercises at the same time. I also think, since the world is unpredictable, that given the great country that we are citizens of, we should have centers of excellence. It could be places like this where we follow, analyze, understand all regions and countries of the world. It could be several centers, trusted centers, independent centers where the country can turn to when something unanticipated with regard to a distant country that we don't know very well develops. Our national security establishment at the time of 9/11 was largely the product of the Soviet experience. Our big leaders were all experts on the Soviet Union, very minute aspects of Soviet military, for example. But the challenge was this new part of, obviously it's not a new part of the world, but the challenges that we became focused on were very new. And we had very few people who had the understanding of that region on their fingertips. And because we didn't know as much as we should have on a region that became critical, I think there were assumptions made or beliefs that informed the decisions that turned out not to be as accurate as possible. And I believe I mean, we could talk about what they were, and I could tell you stories about those things, and there are stories in the book as to what some assumptions were. But I believe that we need to given the uncertainty and unpredictability, and given the lessons of Afghanistan, to me, we need. There is no country that you can really, if Afghanistan could be important, and I can say that without having an insult, that 15 years later we are still at war. We have spent maybe close to $1 trillion. Even smart people like Henry Kissinger, for example, wouldn't have anticipated in 97, 98 that this is what we're going to be focused on for so many years. And therefore, we need centers of excellence, trusted centers where we can turn to when the anticipated, but not dismissible, can happen. And that's the lesson on Afghanistan. The third point is on the lesson with regard to democracy promotion. I believe that the very basic documents of the United States postulates that all human beings are equal and endowed with the same rights as others, including the right to be free. And we've had a tendency, as in the case of nation building, between those who believe that the mission of the United States should be, and President George W. Bush in the second term particularly focused on it, to promote democracy. Because if the world becomes democracy, war becomes less likely. The world, if you promote democracy, with it comes economic development, prosperity, with it comes rule of law. And all of that is good. I have to say that based on my experience, our organizations and our strategies for promoting democracy needs to be reviewed. And there has to be a balance between being an evangelist of democracy, promotion of democracy, and being a shining city on the hill as an example that others could follow. Because I have learned that we are good at supporting civil society organizations, where groups of Afghans, Iraqis, from wherever, try to hold their government accountable, try to push for free press, try to push for rule of law, try to highlight corruption, try to highlight government accountability, and we can support them. We're good at that. But then, when civil society is able to overthrow governments, governments that do not change or do not adjust, do not reform, even when elections come, from 1,000 or tens of thousands of civil society, we have a hard time to encourage the establishment of one or two parties that can compete for elections, that can govern them. Without that, promoting democracy could become the spread of anarchy, where then authoritarian parties can take more advantage of, take charge, as we've seen in some parts of the Middle East. And I remember from my own experience in Iraq, in particular, where the Iraqis embraced the concept of a parliamentary system. The Afghans had embraced a unitary state presidential system. But to be effective in politics, the role of parliament became important. Now, we were spending, the United States, billions of dollars on the military aspects, the security aspects of Iraq. But politics, if not done right, can create challenges that can produce security challenges that we have to deal with. If politics produce sectarianism, not treating the Shia majority, not treating the Sunni minority right, or relations on ethnic ground between Arabs and Kurds were not handled correctly. It produced tension, produced conflict, produced security problems, including extremism. But yet, in the years that we were spending billions on the security side, I had no resources to support political parties that believe in a balanced relationship with the other communities, or a consensus among communities, respect between different communities, rule of law. And the reason was for us, for good reasons, many years ago, that in order to help political parties in an election that would be interfering in the democratic process. And there have been some bad experiences that we had gone through, although there were some good experiences. If it wasn't our support in Greece or in Italy after World War II, those countries might have gone communist and the whole history of Europe would have been different. But the reforms of the 70s produced a situation in which, in order to do an initiative, you have the president has to sign a finding. That finding has to be briefed to members of Congress, select group, and the fear of leak that we were doing that discouraged the administration from doing so. But yet, rival powers in the region, let's say in the case of Iraq, Iran, or others that no such qualm about helping. How do we create a level playing field for politics to work? And I believe that going forward, we need to decide on how much of a role does democracy promotion play in our foreign policy, how we pursue it, how do you deal with civil society versus parties. We do well, in my view, with regard to civil society. How do we do parties? And then how do you, if you do want to do it, how do you create a level playing field when elections take place? And how do we organize the country, our institutions, because the responsibility for promoting democracy is very diffused throughout different institutions of the state, and there's lots of duplications. How do we do a better orchestrated effort? A couple of more points before I go to your question and observations. The United States is a unique power. It has had, despite the observations of de Tocqueville, a great scholar of America, a French scholar, that democracy and foreign policy success, especially on issues that require a long time to achieve results, is difficult because of the necessity of elections, because elections need the support of the public to be successful, and public are impatient, and therefore long-term projects, especially that are costly, cannot be pursued successfully by a democracy. I believe that we did extremely well, contrary to de Tocqueville's observation, during the Cold War. There was a broad consensus, bipartisan consensus, that the Soviet Union was the threat, and that we needed to pursue a policy of containment of the Soviet Union. There were democratic and republican differences on nuances here and there. Should we do more of this, less of something else? But a containment strategy we followed for more than 40 years and proved ultimately to be successful. So we can do so. However, when you have a lot of problems, challenges, not a central kind of a huge problem that can concentrate everyone's attention like a nuclear war, that problem becomes much harder to get consensus on a whole range of issues. But I think it's not out of the question that we can. I think a lot depends on the president's leadership. But I do believe that one thing that has happened that makes it harder, and I think that, in particular when the people can see that what you're saying is not convincing. When you say we are winning, we are succeeding, and they can see because of the information available, we live in the age of information, that things are not going as well as you say, particularly when there are American casualties involved. People lose confidence in the strategy, and you cannot persist. We have persisted in Korea now for 67 years plus. But it was very difficult after the first 5 or 6 years to sustain public opinion. One other thing that has happened, and I don't have the answer for, which you might, which is that we live in the age of information, constant coverage, and PR becomes very important to keep the the people informed and to shape responses. The spokesman system that we have in all our government, transparency requires it, but the PR dimension, which I had to deal with in my embassies, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that they push you to look that you're succeeding constantly, that you are overcoming challenges, that PR department do not let you really state things as they really are. The difficult, the unsuccessful, the adjustments you need to make, which is quite complicated. And sort of this requirements to appear positive, to give positive news, to give a positive twist, and even that it may be a slight or significant variance with what you're doing, it creates a public opinion problem for sustaining support. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because we do need a bipartisan and sustainable long-term policy to succeed. And when we have had that, we have succeeded. Look at what we did after World War II, not to mention World War II itself, in terms of the institutions that were created, the alliances that were created, international organizations that were created, the turning of Europe and East Asia to zones of progress and peace. These were dysfunctional regions of the world that we turned into allies and successful regions. But those regions are also changing, and they're under threat now. Those achievements are under threat. Europe, we thought, was a finished project, but it's yet now we're talking once again about the future of Europe. We thought Russia had changed and that it was going to become part of Europe, and we know it's at this point going in another direction. So I think you're coming of age at a time of huge challenges in our foreign policy, and I hope what I've written can help you as you get ready to take on responsibility and participate in shaping the future. So thank you very much.